Do you believe that an ordinary, frail individual full of uncertainties can become the commander of one of the greatest triumphs of all time? The story of Gideon is evidence that, even in the most distressing situations, God uses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. In a time of obscurity and oppression, while an entire nation suffered at the hands of its enemies, God chose someone who could barely believe in himself. How did a hidden man, threshing wheat to survive, transform into the leader of a host of only 300 men? And how did such an implausible and absurd strategy become the nightmare of an innumerable enemy army? Gideon's journey is not just about faith, but about bravery in the dark, impossible decisions, and the consequences of trusting or deviating from the divine plan. Join us in this exploration of the scriptures to understand how Gideon's life reveals the grace and power of God, transforming weakness into victory in the most challenging moments. Israel lived under the domination of the Midianites, a relentless and cruel people who, year after year, invaded the lands, plundered the harvests, and destroyed everything in their path. The fear that hung over the people of Israel was almost palpable, like a dense cloud that covered the entire territory and prevented any hope from flourishing. The wheat and barley crops and even the vineyards, once a source of sustenance and joy, were now a scene of ruins and ashes. The pillaging occurred so frequently that many became accustomed to burying their belongings or fleeing to makeshift hiding places. Men, women, and children took shelter in dark caves on the slopes of the mountains, trying to protect themselves and save the little that remained of their property. There, in the cold and damp interior of these caves, one could hear the echo of mothers' sobs, worried about the lack of food for their children. Fathers despaired over the sustenance of their families. The fear was so great that at the slightest sign of approaching strangers, whether the sound of horses or chariots in the distance, everyone ran to hide, fearing that the Midianites would come once more to steal the little they had managed to keep. The scenario, therefore, was one of absolute desolation. Piles of trampled grain, destroyed granaries, devastated gardens. Joy had been replaced by the daily uncertainty about what to eat and whether the enemy would appear to steal the little they had saved. Every season, when the seeds were cast into the ground, along with them was sown the doubt, will we have any food to harvest this year before the Midianites destroy it? It was in this somber context that we meet Gideon, a simple man from the tribe of Manasseh, of average height, a countenance worn by the arduous routine and a life of privations. Gideon was neither a warrior nor a leader. He was just someone trying to subsist through another day, carrying the pains and frustrations common to all the people of Israel in those times. While some sought definitive refuge in the mountains, Gideon tried to keep a spark of hope alive, working in secret, even though this left him in a constant state of tension. On that specific day, Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress, a place where grapes were pressed and therefore less visible to the raiders. With every stroke he gave to separate the wheat from the chaff, he cast suspicious glances around, attentive to any noise or suspicious movement. His heart beat fast because he knew that if he were discovered, he would lose everything. That was the only way Gideon had to secure some food, even if scarce, for his family. Sweat ran down his face, mixed with the dry earth that clung to his skin. At the same time that he faced the dust of the wheat, he also faced an internal battle, the humiliation of having to hide to do something that should be a basic right, harvesting and preparing his own food. Every blow to the wheat was accompanied by the thought, how long will we live like this? Has God abandoned us? This uncertainty haunted his mind day and night. He could not imagine that same afternoon, his life would change dramatically. And the oppressed one, the common man, the person who had never dreamed of heroic acts, would be called to face one of the most terrifying challenges of his generation. From then on, nothing would be the same. As Gideon finished threshing the wheat, ready to store the grain and quickly disappear so as not to attract anyone's attention, something unusual occurred. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him. At first, he thought it was a stranger, possibly a traveler or worse, a Midianite spy. The scare ran through his entire body, and he felt his blood run cold. His muscles tensed, his breathing caught. However, upon observing more closely, he noticed that this man had a different, almost radiant aura. There was a silent, imposing presence about him, something that could not be described merely as physical strength. The clothes of that figure did not resemble the worn and dirty garments that usually circulated through the villages, much less the heavy clothing of the enemy soldiers. It was as if his feet barely touched the ground. The voice echoed, surprisingly serene, but powerful enough to make Gideon's heart beat even faster. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Those words initially seemed like a jest or a cruel mockery in the face of so much misery and oppression. Gideon, overcome by fear, backed up one step, trying to control the involuntary trembling that ran through his arms. He widened his eyes, and after moments of hesitation stammered, "Who am I to be called mighty? I am the least in my father's house, and my family is the poorest in all the tribe of Manasseh. And besides all that, if the Lord is truly with us, why do we suffer so much? Where are the wonders that our fathers told us about? Where is the God who opened the Red Sea for our ancestors?" For a moment, silence hung in the air, and Gideon could hear only the sound of his own heavy, gasping breath. He looked at that figure and wondered who he was, what it meant, and why he addressed him so confidently. Then the voice resumed, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. I will be with you." The shock made Gideon back up once more. He felt confused and insecure. How could he, an ordinary man, save his people? It was ridiculous, almost a joke. Even so, the firm gaze of that messenger left no room for disbelief. Gideon, overcome by a mixture of fear and curiosity, decided that he needed proof to confirm whether this was really a divine message or just a delusion caused by exhaustion. "If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me," Gideon requested, almost voiceless. He then hurried, preparing an offering. He took a young goat and unleavened bread, put the meat in a basket, poured the broth into a pot, and placed everything on a rock, according to the instructions received. The scene was permeated by an almost unbearable tension. Each beat of Gideon's heart seemed to push time more slowly. His gaze darted from the food to the angel, and from the angel to the food, full of expectation. When the mysterious man touched the offering with the tip of his staff, fire rose from that rock and completely consumed the meat and the bread. It was as if a sacred explosion swept the area. The heat and the flame left Gideon astonished. He felt the force of that fire reverberate in his own body, as if every fiber of his being was being shaken. Unable to contain his terror and reverence, Gideon fell to his knees trembling. His hands were sweating cold, his mouth was dry, and his mind was taken over by a single certainty. "Surely I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Fear completely invaded him, for, according to tradition, seeing the face of God or his messenger could mean death. He feared that this was the end of his life. However, he heard a soft but authoritative voice again. "Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die." These words eased his dread. His heart gradually slowed down, although it continued to beat intensely. Gideon, kneeling with his face to the ground, began to understand that he was facing a calling, not only for himself, but for the entire nation. It was as if a spark of hope sprouted inside him, contrasting with all the darkness that surrounded him. Still stunned by the surreal experience, Gideon returned to his father Joash's house. He spent the rest of the day thoughtful, remembering the flames that had consumed the offering. Night fell, bringing with it an oppressive but also mysterious silence. As the stars shone brightly in the sky, he was surprised by another divine instruction. He should destroy the altar of Baal that his own father had built in the city. Gideon knew well the importance that altar had assumed for his family and for his neighbors. Baal was, for many, the symbol of hope for rain and fertility. If there was a drought or a bad harvest, they sacrificed animals and offered rituals to this pagan god. But now Gideon had a clear command: to completely uproot this idol from the heart of the people of Israel, starting with his own house's altar. The problem was that if he were discovered, he would be considered a traitor by the local inhabitants. Even having already seen the miraculous fire consume the offering, fear still paralyzed his muscles. He thought about the consequences, the fury of Baal's worshippers, the reprisal of the local leaders, and the possibility of an even worse retaliation by the Midianites, who might see that act as a sign of rebellion. However, there was something greater than fear, a growing flame of obedience and certainty that God would give him strength to fulfill that calling. Thus, shrouded by the shadows of the dawn, Gideon gathered 10 of his servants, and under the cloak of darkness, set out for the place where the altar had been erected. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, as if the natural world understood the tension of that moment. With every step, the fine sand crunched beneath his sandals, and Gideon's fingers gripped the handle of a tool that would be used to demolish the structure. His heart refused to beat at a measured pace. Sometimes it raced like a wild horse. Other times it almost stopped at the slightest suspicious noise. He feared being seen by anyone. He feared the noise of the falling stones. He feared the very courage he was about to demonstrate. When they arrived at the altar, they raised their tools and began to loosen the first stones that supported the structure of Baal. A part of the construction gave way, producing a crash that sounded loud in the stillness of the night, almost a screaming alarm for the entire village. The group trembled, looking hastily all around, but everything remained dark and motionless. Between one hammer blow and another, Gideon thought, "Am I really doing this? Am I risking my life to obey God's calling?" Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the dust. His arms hurt, but he persisted. The structure completely collapsed. And then, quickly, they built a new altar for the Lord on the mountain, sacrificing a bull in place of the pagan altar. The odor of the burning meat rose to the heavens, marking that moment as an act of faithfulness to the God of Israel. When dawn broke, the village awoke with surprise and revolt. People gathered around the rubble of Baal's altar. The destruction was total, and there were clear signs of sacrifice to another god. Gideon's name began to circulate. Someone reported having seen him lurking around the place. The crowd became furious and wanted immediate revenge, shouting, "Bring out Gideon, he must die!" The agitation reached the ears of Joash, Gideon's father, who came out in defense of his son. "If Baal is a god, let him plead for himself, because someone has torn down his altar." Those courageous words momentarily silenced the enraged mob. Part of the crowd hesitated. If Baal was so powerful, why would he not take revenge on his own? There were those who considered Joash's reaction challenging, but the people decided to wait and see if any curse would fall upon Gideon. In the meantime, the young man's courage began to spread. Many realized that Gideon had not acted out of caprice. He was overcome by an extraordinary conviction, never before seen in someone so simple. Thus, Gideon went from an anonymous and fearful man, threshing wheat in hiding, to someone who dared to challenge the established idols. And somehow, that act, although done in the dead of night, brought to light a new feeling among the people. Perhaps there was still hope for liberation. As the Midianites intensified their oppression, raiding not only the harvests, but also cattle and winter provisions, the idea of a revolt against them began to gain momentum. Men from various tribes of Israel realized that it was time to do something. And when Gideon summoned an army, he did not do so without hesitation. The doubt was still in his heart. Why me? What is the meaning of all this? However, the news of his audacious act against the altar of Baal spread quickly. Many began to see him as a deliverer who had divine support. Thus, from different tribes, men began to arrive. Some brought rusty swords and old shields. Others could only count on makeshift spears and wooden bows. But all came with a common desire to put an end to the humiliation and suffering. Gideon's camp grew in a few days, reaching the remarkable sum of 32,000 soldiers. This was not a properly disciplined or equipped army. It was a multitude of indignant Israelites, tired of fleeing, willing to risk their lives for the possibility of freedom. The fervor of rebellion and hope echoed, and many recalled ancient stories of miraculous deliverances, pleading with God to do it again. However, in the face of the massive Midianite contingent, calculated in much superior numbers, it was still an enormous challenge. Gideon, knowing that each life was precious, felt the overwhelming pressure of not leading those people to disaster. In his prayers, he cried out, "Lord, give me wisdom. Do not allow this army to perish in vain." It was then that a new divine instruction arrived. God wanted to show that victory would not come from merely human strategies, nor from numerical strength. He ordered Gideon to dismiss all the men who were afraid. This determination was shocking, as the insecurity of going to war was natural. Even so, Gideon obeyed, gathering the army and declaring, "Those who tremble with fear or prefer to return to their families can withdraw." More than 22,000 soldiers left. Only 10,000 remained. Imagine the psychological impact of this. Seeing 2/3 of the army standing up and returning to the villages, the tents emptied, the dust rose with the tramp of those who departed. Those who remained looked around, wondering if they had made the right choice. After all, they were now only 1/3 of the initial contingent. To increase the tension, God said again, "The people are still too many." Gideon felt a chill down his spine. How would they face an enemy army with even fewer men? Obeying the divine voice, he led the 10,000 to a stream and asked them to drink water. The scene was curious. Exhausted, thirsty men approaching the crystal-clear current to quench their thirst. Some plunged their faces directly into the water, drinking with urgency, almost carelessly. Others brought the water to their mouths with their hands, maintaining vigilance around, ready for any threat. God instructed Gideon to separate those who had brought the water to their mouths with their hands. This group, the most cautious and attentive, numbered only 300 men. The rest should be dismissed. Now Gideon's army was reduced to a ridiculously small force compared to the enemy. Gideon looked at those 300 warriors and felt the weight of responsibility. In his inner being, he trembled with fear, but also kept the flame of faith alive. It was impossible to ignore that God was conducting all that. There was no room for human reasoning that could explain the path taken. The remaining 300 men were physically different, had diverse histories, but shared the same determination. They would fight to the end. The scenario was, from a human point of view, absolutely desperate. Facing such a numerous enemy with only 300 seemed madness. Even so, they remained firm beside Gideon, trusting in the divine choice. Before continuing, we ask for your collaboration. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video to bless us and continue spreading these Bible stories. Now we continue with the story of how Gideon won the war with only 300 men. At night, when the camp was plunged into darkness, Gideon withdrew to pray and seek more guidance. His heart was heavy. How could he lead 300 against thousands? What if God had abandoned him at the last moment? What if he had misunderstood everything? Fear returned to haunt his mind, but a new instruction arrived, unexpected and peculiar. The 300 would not use conventional weapons. Instead of swords or spears, each man would receive a trumpet, a lighted torch, and a clay jar to cover the torch. One can imagine the shock of Gideon and the soldiers upon hearing this order. "What do you mean we won't use swords? We are going to the battlefield armed with trumpets, torches, and clay pots." Many looked at each other surprised, but did not dare to openly question, because they trusted in Gideon's leadership and, above all, in the promise that God would fight for them. The decisive moment arrived. In the dead of night, the 300 divided into 3 groups of 100 and surrounded the Midianite camp, which stretched throughout the valley. That enemy mass had well-armed warriors, horses, and camels resting in silence. Tents dotted the night landscape like a constellation of stars on the ground. The number of fires signaled the grandeur of that army. The dread was undeniable. Every Israelite who observed that felt their heart tighten. Gideon, positioned at a strategic point, waited for the right moment, when the enemy guard would be least attentive. Then he raised his trumpet and put it to his lips, tasting the bitter metal. For a second he hesitated. His entire body trembled. But he gave the initial blow, which was immediately followed by the other 299 trumpet blasts. A strident, deafening clangor cut the silence of the valley. Almost at the same time, the men broke the clay jars, revealing the lighted torches as if stars were falling from the sky. Suddenly, there were hundreds of points of light around the camp, accompanied by the sound of broken vessels. And also, a shouting echoed through the valley. "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" Confusion took over the Midianites, who woke up startled. Soldiers came out disoriented from their tents, not knowing where the attack was coming from. They were faced with lights everywhere, sounds of trumpets that seemed multiplied by the echo in the mountains. In the midst of the darkness, disorientation was total. Many, in panic, brandished their weapons aimlessly, even injuring their own companions. Horses reared out of control, and the camp became a real uproar. The divine stratagem had worked beyond human comprehension. The surprise was so overwhelming that the Midianites, believing they were surrounded by an immensely superior army, collapsed. Screams of agony and dread mingled with the uninterrupted sound of the trumpets, which thundered in everyone's ears. In a few minutes, what was once an invincible army had crumbled in total disorder. For Gideon, that moment was both terrifying and sublime. He saw the power of God acting, but he also witnessed scenes of destruction, ungoverned men throwing blades at each other, horses trampling anything that appeared in front of them, tents on fire. Everything was frenetic and frightening. The smell of smoke, sweat, and blood quickly permeated the air. A few meters away, Gideon could hear the cries of pain, the clanging of weapons falling to the ground, and the ringing of the trumpets. His body trembled, whether from adrenaline or fear, and his throat dried from the horror of so much chaos. With the Midianite camp in disarray, the next step was to pursue the enemy leaders who were fleeing. Zebah and Zalmunna, generals famous for their cruelty, escaped with part of their troops. Gideon, now strengthened by the conviction that God was on his side, summoned his men to go after them. Despite the euphoria of the initial victory, the 300 were exhausted. They had spent the whole night on vigil and the dawn in psychological combat, blowing trumpets, staying alert so as not to be surprised. Their legs hurt, their eyes burned with fatigue, their thirst was pressing. Even so, the flame of triumph drove them forward. Gideon led the march, feeling the cold morning wind on his face, trying to suppress the whirlwind of thoughts that assailed him. What if the Midianites regroup further ahead? What if this initial success was just a stroke of luck? They knew that the battle would not end until Zebah and Zalmunna were captured or killed. Therefore, even feeling their strength diminish, they ran through narrow trails and winding paths, seeking to corner the fugitives. At one point, Gideon and his men arrived at Succoth, a city of Israel, and asked for food and water to replenish their energy. However, to their surprise, they were denied. The city leaders doubted that Gideon could really capture the Midianite generals. They feared reprisals if they helped such a small army, which in their view could be annihilated at any moment. The refusal was painful and humiliating, Those men who risked their lives to free Israel were now treated with distrust even by their own countrymen. Fatigue hit harder and discouragement lurked. Even so, there was no time for prolonged discussions. Gideon merely declared with firmness in his eyes, "When the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will return and punish you for not helping your brothers." They moved forward, and the same scene repeated itself in Penuel. Again they were rejected, and again Gideon promised to return to settle accounts. All that filled him with a certain fury, not only against the enemies, but also against the incredulity of his own people. It was as if ingratitude was more hurtful than the enemy's arrows. Finally, after several days of pursuit, Gideon and his men managed to surround the Midianite generals and capture them. The news spread like wildfire. The enemy army was officially defeated, and its leaders were in Gideon's hands. The triumphant return to Israel was marked by a bittersweet feeling. There was joy at the conquest, but also indignation towards those who refused to support the cause. When Gideon returned to Succoth and Penuel, he kept his word, severely punishing the local leaders. He made it clear that that victory was God's work and that no one should despise the divine action among his people. He did not act with mercy. Perhaps fatigue, pain, disappointment, and anger led him to extreme rigor. These later acts would mark him, showing that although he was chosen and anointed by God for a specific mission, he was still a man subject to flaws and intense emotions. With the Midianites defeated, the people of Israel finally experienced a relief they had long been without. The harvests could be made without the constant threat of raiders, and families returned from the caves to their homes. There was feasting, songs of gratitude, banquets celebrated with the little that remained of provisions. And at the center of this celebration was Gideon. The people, euphoric with the liberation, approached Gideon with a clear request: "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson." The proposal was tempting. Gideon, who until recently considered himself the least in his father's house, was now seen as a national hero. His name was spoken with reverence and admiration. Those who previously ignored him now sought his approval. It was the type of situation in which the ego can quickly inflate, leading to arrogance and destruction. However, Gideon proved faithful to the principle that guided his life since that encounter with the angel of the Lord. He replied publicly, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." This refusal evidenced Gideon's understanding that the victory was not a personal conquest, but the result of divine intervention. However, he made a request. He asked that each man give him a golden earring obtained from the spoils of war. As the Midianites were known to wear a lot of jewelry, a large pile of gold soon formed at Gideon's feet. With that gold, he had an ephod made, possibly a religious piece that would remind all the people of God's presence and direction. Initially, the object was intended to be a memorial, a point of connection with the God who had given Israel the victory. However, as time went on, what was meant to be a symbol of gratitude ended up becoming an idol. The people's hearts strayed, and many began to worship the ephod itself, forgetting God. For Gideon, this was a bitter sign that even after great miracles and deeds, the people of Israel had a tendency to return to idolatry. However much he had good intentions in creating the ephod, fragile and fickle humanity found ways to become corrupted. The power that he had previously refused now lurked in another form, through an object that induced vanity and idolatry. Gideon lived for many years, and while he was alive, Israel enjoyed peace. The tribes that were previously weakened rose again, new crops flourished, and the memory of the Midianite oppression was gradually replaced by a sense of security and prosperity. Gideon had many sons, and his family became large and respected. However, after Gideon's death, the nation once again entered a cycle of forgetting God. the people began to incline once more to the pagan practices of neighboring peoples. Without a reference leader, the tribes began to disperse and internal disputes arose. It was in this context that Abimelech, one of Gideon's sons, rose up to claim absolute power. Ambitious and cruel, Abimelech plotted the death of his own brothers so as not to have competitors. The blood of Gideon's descendants stained the Israelite soil, bringing great sadness. Abimelech's leadership was marked by violence, oppression, and intrigue, showing that the next generation does not always inherit the character and faithfulness of the fathers. Abimelech's fall was as brutal as his reign. During an assault against an enemy city, he approached a tower where many people were taking refuge. An anonymous woman from the top of the tower threw a millstone that hit Abimelech's head, mortally wounding him. Fearing to die at the hands of a woman, he ordered his armor-bearer to kill him with the sword, and thus his reign of dishonor ended, closing another tragic chapter in Israel's history. Gideon's trajectory, therefore, did not end in absolute glory. His legacy was stained by the idolatry that was established after the creation of the ephod and by the cruelty of his own son. Even so, it is impossible to ignore the fact that in that period, God used Gideon in a singular way, showing that the true strength of Israel came from above and not from human ability. The story of Gideon is a roller coaster of faith, courage, fears, doubts, and consequences that extend beyond his own life. In him, we see an ordinary man who considered himself incapable, but who was transformed. The most impactful and terrifying moment, without a doubt, was when he had the vision of the angel and realized that he was before a supernatural manifestation. The intensity of the fire consuming the offering, the magnitude of facing a celestial being face to face, all this plunged him into a state of reverent terror. He understood that this was not just a miracle, but a divine calling that demanded much more from him than he had imagined. Contemplating the presence of an angel of the Lord up close meant taking unimaginable risks. Gideon feared for his own life, believing that seeing the face of a messenger of God could bring him death. The reverence before the sacred took away his strength, and his body trembled, for the divine glory enveloped him completely. It was in that instant that, terrified, he realized that he was being called not only to change his personal history, but to change the course of an entire people. When we recall this crucial point, the angel announcing to Gideon that he would be used to free Israel, we realize the dimension of the challenge that opened up before him. The tension comes from the clash between God's grandiose vision and Gideon's sense of insignificance. He felt tiny, the least in his house, and nurtured a series of questions. Where is God amidst all this? Why do we suffer so much? How can I be a warrior if I don't even have battle experience? The emotional impact is gigantic, as it is a direct confrontation between faith and fear, between the human and the supernatural. All the narrative that follows, the destruction of the altar of Baal, the formation of the army, the drastic reduction to 300 men, the unusual strategy with trumpets and torches, is permeated by the courage that springs from that encounter. It was not Gideon's innate courage, but the conviction generated amidst the terror of knowing that God would not abandon him. Every decision Gideon made later was impregnated with the residue of that memory. The angel of the Lord is with me, therefore I must not fear. On the other hand, the story also shows us how vulnerable we are to the traps of power and idolatry. Gideon, even having witnessed incredible miracles, ends up creating an object, the ephod, which becomes a focus of undue worship. The people easily strayed into idolatry, proving that our mind and heart can become corrupted, even after witnessing the supernatural. And the sequence of the narrative, with Abimelech, evidences that the life of a faithful leader does not guarantee the righteousness of his descendants. The path of violence chosen by Abimelech reveals the corrupted human nature which knocks at the door at every moment. There is no permanent security in past conquests. It is necessary to renew the surrender and obedience to God every day, or we run the risk of regressing to chaos. In summary, Gideon's story contains profoundly relevant lessons. God uses ordinary people to accomplish the extraordinary. Fear can be overcome when we cling to divine promises. Victory belongs to the Lord, not to human strength. Our flesh is weak and can lead us to idolatry even after great conquests. Each generation needs to make its choice and cannot live off the glory of the past. The most terrifying moment in this entire trajectory was not just the confrontation with the Midianite army, but rather the encounter with the angel of the Lord, which revealed to Gideon not only the magnitude of the calling, but also his own smallness. In that instant of sacred terror, Gideon realized that his life was no longer his own, but part of a greater plan that transcended him. And for each of us remains the reflection. Many times, faced with the challenges of life, we feel like Gideon, frail, incapable, and surrounded by oppression. However, if we trust in the God who calls, we can win battles that, humanly speaking, would be impossible. When you hear this story, remember, no matter how small or insignificant you feel, God can use you to do extraordinary things. Just trust and obey, even when your heart is filled with trembling. In the same way that Gideon saw the fire arise and consume the offering, we can see the divine power manifest itself in an astonishingly grandiose way, proving that human weakness is the perfect stage for the demonstration of God's strength. If you like this story, 2 other similar biblical story videos will appear on your screen. Click to watch them, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. May God be with.